I made a dreadful mistake, and I'm afraid I'll have to face the consequences for the rest of my life. You can call me Cindy, 23 years old, and my boyfriend is Cameron, 25 years old. Both of us hail from a small town in Oklahoma. Given that he was a couple of years older than me, we were acquainted but hadn't really connected on a personal level. Our opportunity to get better acquainted came just over 3 years ago at the grocery store where I was employed as a cashier. Whenever Cameron returned from college during weekends or breaks, he would frequently visit our store to grab pre-made meals and a kombucha tea for lunch. I typically worked the express checkout, and if he happened to be there when I was on duty, he'd opt for my register. He always conducted himself with politeness and kindness, and I found him incredibly endearing. The sound of his voice had a way of melting my heart and sending shivers down my spine. I attempted to drop numerous subtle hints to express my interest, but he didn't seem to pick up on them. Then, one day when he was checking out and my line was moving slowly, I decided to strike up a conversation by asking him about his major. I continued asking questions as a way to demonstrate my interest, and after roughly 10 minutes, he finally caught on. Just as a couple of shoppers with baskets started heading towards my register, Cameron remarked, "Looks like you're getting busy. Here, let me give you my number." And he jotted it down on the receipt I handed him. He departed and suggested that I should call him whenever I had some free time. This occurred on a Saturday, and my work shift ended at 3 p.m. The moment I finished work and reached my car, I dialed his number and we conversed for a solid 2 hours. He extended an invitation for dinner that same night, and I enthusiastically agreed. Our connection was immediate, and we became intimate during our second date, which took place the following day, just before he returned to school. It might sound crazy, but that weekend I fell head over heels in love with him. We continued to see each other every weekend, with either Cameron driving home or me making the journey to his college to spend time together. Things were going wonderfully. Upon graduating, Cameron secured a good job in the city, purchased a new Wrangler, and acquired a nice apartment close to his workplace. A few months later, he proposed that I move in with him, and I eagerly agreed. Although our parents weren't entirely on board with us cohabitating before marriage, they supported our relationship because they liked both of us. Cameron clarified to me and our parents that this was a trial run to assess our compatibility for marriage. I was overjoyed. Our relationship was flourishing, and we thoroughly enjoyed our lives in the bustling city after growing up in a small rural town. There was an abundance of activities to partake in and a wealth of intelligent, fascinating people to meet. We felt like we belonged. I found a job at a locally owned coffee shop just a few blocks from our apartment, and I absolutely relished my work there. The owners were incredibly friendly, and our customers proved to be quite fascinating. I had the pleasure of meeting many wonderful people, and I still maintain contact with most of my regular customers through social media. Cameron and I had been cohabitating for nearly 9 months, while he had resided in the apartment for over 10 months. Consequently, we began exploring other apartments in the area, even though we loved our current place. We were simply curious to see what other options were available. We visited more than a dozen apartments, and it was enjoyable to observe the various apartment designs and layouts. Should we decide to move, Cameron would need to provide written notice to our landlord 30 days before his lease expired to avoid automatic renewal. A month later, I had joined a local yoga class within walking distance of our apartment, but in the opposite direction from my coffee shop. One of the regulars at the yoga studio happened to frequent our coffee shop as well. Let's call him Ed for privacy reasons. Ed was an attractive older gentleman with a well-built physique, and I estimated his age to be in his late 40s, around the same age as my parents. Ed had always been exceptionally friendly to all of us at the coffee shop, engaging in extensive conversations with everyone, not just me. He would spend a couple of hours daily working on his laptop at our shop. Ed had mentioned that he was an entrepreneur, and I assumed he must have been successful since he drove a new Bronco and dressed in stylish clothes with matching shoes and jewelry. To get to the point, one day I struck up a conversation with Ed and inquired about yoga, as I was intrigued by his evident passion for it. I asked if he would recommend the yoga studio he frequented. He recommended that I give yoga a try, mentioning that I would likely enjoy it. I decided to visit the yoga studio myself, and after touring the facility, I found it appealing. Moreover, it was conveniently located within walking distance of our apartment. While Cameron was a member of a large gym located just across the street from his office, it was more than 20 minutes away, and the commute could stretch to 35 minutes or more with traffic. I didn't want to drive my old beat-up Saturn such a long distance. I began attending yoga classes and quickly developed a strong fondness for it. Typically, I would head to the studio immediately after my work shift ended at 2 p.m. This schedule worked out perfectly, as I followed a routine of working from 6 a.m. to 2 p.m., attending the yoga studio until 3:30 p.m., and then returning home to prepare dinner for Cameron. During one of my shifts at the coffee shop, Ed inquired about my experience at the studio. I expressed my enthusiasm for it and thanked him for the recommendation. He asked about the time I went, and I informed him that I attended right after work at 2 p.m. Ed mentioned that he might start attending classes around that time as well, explaining that he planned to incorporate hot yoga into his routine a few days a week, with those classes starting at 1:30 p.m. Additionally, he revealed that he spent 5 days a week at a local gym, engaging in weightlifting and boxing. A couple of days later, I encountered Ed at the yoga studio. We engaged in conversation, just as we had done at the coffee shop, and he eventually convinced me to try a hot yoga class. I gave it a shot and found that I loved it. As time passed, we began spending more and more time together at the studio, taking classes together. In hindsight, I can see how inappropriate this was, but at the time such considerations never crossed my mind. This continued for several weeks until, one day, I can't explain why or how, Ed and I found ourselves back at Cameron's apartment on a Thursday afternoon, where we did something truly regrettable. A mistake I deeply repent now. I felt an overwhelming sense of guilt for my actions, but I reluctantly agreed to meet Ed again at his place the following Monday, as I didn't want to show disrespect to Cameron by bringing Ed back to his home. Ed's apartment turned out to be in a rather sketchy neighborhood. It was quite sparsely furnished, featuring only a couple of old chairs, a television, a small dining table with 2 chairs, a modest double bed, and an aged dresser. It wasn't what I had expected, and I considered leaving. In retrospect, I wish I had, but I didn't want to come across as impolite. It became evident that Ed was not the prosperous entrepreneur I had assumed him to be, as he seemed to have invested most of his money in his car, clothing, and jewelry rather than his living space. Following that encounter, I informed Ed that we needed to terminate our relationship because I loved my boyfriend and didn't want to jeopardize what we had. Ed regarded me cynically and chuckled, suggesting, "You can't possibly love your boyfriend if you just did what you did, can you?" I replied, "I do love him more than anything." He retorted, "Well, you may love him, but your desire for me outweighs your feelings for him by far." It was a harsh reality check for me, and I insisted, "No, that's not true." I gathered my belongings and left Ed's apartment. As I exited, I felt tainted and incredibly foolish for my actions. This wasn't characteristic of me, I promise it's not. I don't know, but what happened with Ed occurred during a time of the month when my hormones often feel uncontrollable. This isn't an excuse. I'm simply attempting to make sense of my actions. I spent the rest of the afternoon in tears until Cameron returned home. We had dinner, watched TV, and relaxed on the couch, but I noticed that Cameron seemed distant. He had been feeling unwell for several days, so I assumed it was because of that. On Tuesday, he appeared normal but still kept his distance, mentioning that he didn't feel quite right. It had been nearly a week since we had been intimate, and I started to worry about his health because we usually weren't abstaining. Looking back, I suspect he might have known about Ed and me and was keeping his distance. On Wednesday, I got home just before 3 p.m. and reached for my apartment key, but it wasn't on my key ring. I began to panic, wondering if it had somehow fallen off. The key ring itself wasn't broken, and all my other keys were still there. But the apartment key was missing. I considered the possibility that it had broken off, but I couldn't figure out how. Then the thought crossed my mind. Could someone have taken it off my key ring to gain access to our apartment? In hindsight, I realized that Cameron had removed it. I tried calling Cameron multiple times and sent him text messages, but there was no response. This was unusual because he typically would send a quick text saying he was busy. I decided to go to the apartment office and ask them to let me in, as they had keys to all the apartments in our building. I explained the situation to one of the coordinators, who then went into the manager's office and closed the door. A few minutes later, they called me back into the office and asked me to take a seat. The manager explained to me that Cameron had moved out that morning and provided a letter to terminate the lease at the end of its one-year term. Upon hearing this, all I could manage was to utter a shocked, "What?" before bursting into tears. The manager informed me that Cameron had left several bags of his belongings for me in the adjacent office, which they had locked. They escorted me to the office where I found 3 large laundry bags containing all my personal belongings, including numerous gifts I had purchased for Cameron over the years. It suddenly hit me that he must have known about Ed and me, and I completely fell apart in front of these compassionate ladies. They kindly assisted me in carrying the bags to my car and even urged me to sit down for a few minutes, concerned about my emotional state and safety on the road. The manager inquired if there was someone they could contact on my behalf. I declined, assuring them I would manage on my own. I mentioned my intention to sit in my car and regain my composure before departing. I also inquired about whether Cameron had provided a forwarding address, but they explained that they couldn't disclose it due to privacy regulations. They went above and beyond, offering me some bottles of water, granola bars, and a box of tissues. Their kindness prevented me from making impulsive decisions in my distressed state. I remained in my car for over an hour, sobbing and contemplating my next steps. I made numerous attempts to reach Cameron, both on his cell phone and at his office, but received no response. In one of my messages, I inquired if I could stay in the now vacant apartment until the end of the lease, since he was the one paying for it. I had hoped this question would prompt a response, but it didn't. I knew he was furious. Interestingly, he hadn't blocked my calls or messages, which provided a glimmer of hope. Although I briefly considered going to his office to confront him, I ultimately decided against it, as I didn't want to create a scene in his workplace. Any actions that might jeopardize his job or professional reputation were out of the question, as he was highly respected within the company and had a promising career ahead of him. Instead, I opted to drive aimlessly around town for about an hour, pondering my next steps. Eventually, I decided to check into a recently opened Homestyle Suites hotel near our apartment. They were running a grand opening special with rates at $79 per night or $399 per week. It was essential to find a place to stay, even though I knew I couldn't afford an extended stay there. Once I settled into the hotel room, I spent the entire night in tears, wondering how Cameron had discovered the truth. I could only come up with 2 possibilities. Firstly, that Ed had informed him directly or through someone else, and secondly, the unsettling thought that Cameron might have had surveillance cameras in our apartment. I hoped fervently that it was the former, as I dreaded the idea of Cameron witnessing me with another man. I felt utterly ashamed of myself, like a terrible person who had inflicted pain on the person I loved most and who had treated me so well. The following day, I received a call from my mother, and she was incredibly furious, more enraged than I had ever heard her. She demanded, "What on earth did you do?" I feigned ignorance, but she revealed that she had just spoken with Cameron's mother, who informed her that Cameron had revealed we had broken up because I had been intimate with an older man. I reluctantly admitted to the truth, telling my mother that it was accurate and that I was sorry. My mom proceeded to unleash a torrent of yelling, screaming, and tears during our conversation, which lasted for over 45 minutes before she abruptly hung up on me. Afterward, my dad called and expressed his profound disappointment in me, which shattered my heart. I asked if I could move back home, and he agreed on the condition that I seek professional help, possibly a therapist. I accepted this condition, apologized once more, and inquired if he still loved me. He affirmed his love but emphasized his overwhelming disappointment. I handed in my resignation at the coffee shop and returned home 11 days later. Throughout this period, I kept trying to reach out to Cameron, but he never replied. After doing some research online, I came across advice suggesting it's best to give a betrayed partner some space, which I tried to do, even though it was tearing me apart inside. Upon my return home, it seemed like everyone in town was aware of our breakup and the reasons behind it. It felt like an absolute nightmare. I want to ask if there's any way to reconcile with Cameron. I'm unsure of how he discovered the truth or what he might have seen, but given his personality, I fear he may never be willing to communicate with me again. My love for him is profound, and I'm fully aware that I need to make every effort to win him back. Irrespective of the outcome, I'll carry the weight of my actions as regret for the rest of my life. Thank you, and I kindly request that your comments be compassionate. Update. I'm back home now, living with my mom and dad, and I've taken a job as a cashier at a newly opened dollar store in town. It seems like everyone in this town is still talking about me, and I can't help but feel incredibly embarrassed. Somehow, people managed to figure out that Ed was the person I cheated with, and did some online research. To my shock, I discovered that Ed is actually 62 years old. I had no clue about his age, and I previously thought he was in his late 40s. What's even worse is that he has a criminal record dating back 17 years, with 2 newspaper articles about his past arrests and trials still accessible online. I could have easily found all this information with a simple online search, but I was too preoccupied to do so. It's still hard to believe I acted the way I did during that time. I feel like an utter fool now. Not only did I betray the man I love, but I did so with someone who's far from admirable. I hope the town's gossip will eventually die down in a few months, as I don't think I can bear living here much longer. It's taking a heavy toll on my mental well-being. Some days I contemplate just locking myself in my room and not facing the world. My parents are deeply embarrassed by my actions. They've made it clear that if I ever repeat something like this, they'll disown me without hesitation. They believe I've brought profound shame to the family, which has only intensified my feelings of self-disgust. I've been grappling with severe depression as a result. Throughout this entire ordeal, Cameron has not reached out to me. We haven't exchanged a single word since the night before he locked me out of the apartment. I just wish he would pick up the phone and express his anger or any emotion, really. At this point, all I want is to apologize to him face to face. It would provide me with some sense of closure. I've been in therapy for a couple of weeks now, and it's been helpful. My therapist is compassionate, but also quite straightforward. Following her advice, I've refrained from trying to contact Cameron and have started focusing on self-improvement. She pointed out that I've already extended my apologies through text and voicemail. Cameron is aware of it, but evidently he wants nothing to do with me at the moment. Over the past week, I've concentrated on my job, maintaining a healthy diet, getting enough rest, and taking long walks. I do feel better, but I still miss my partner. I'm taking each day as it comes, hoping for a reconciliation with Cameron, but also preparing for the possibility that it may not happen. I have no intentions of dating anyone anytime soon, despite receiving requests from 4 customers at the store. My heart and mind are still firmly under Cameron's influence. I don't anticipate providing any further updates unless we manage to reunite. Best wishes, and thank you to all of you.
All right, that was a fun story. Now let's move on to another exciting one. Stay tuned, and let's dive in.
I'm almost done with my divorce after being married for 23 years to my wife, Connie. We got married when I was 23 and she was 21. We met at college during my 3rd year and we quickly got together. We knew we would get married, and we did right after she finished college. I found a job at a company near where I grew up. My parents ran a working farm there with 8 full-time and 45 seasonal workers. I grew up working on the farm, and so did my brother, Bill. He's 3 years younger than me, and he didn't go to college. Instead, he worked as a laborer on the farm. Over the years, Dad tried giving Bill different management roles, but he preferred being a farm laborer, doing his job and getting paid. He continued doing that until he passed away from cancer earlier this year. The farm has nearly 700 acres and 3 houses. My parents live in the main house, which is set back from the main road and also houses the farm office. My brother lived in the small carriage house where the driveway meets the main road. My wife, kids, and I live in a farmhouse that's 3/4 of a mile down the main road from my parents and brother. My parents purchased the neighboring property through the business to expand the farm and preserved the farmhouse. All 3 homes belong to the family farm corporation, and my brother and I lived in our homes without paying rent. My parents are the only officers in the company, but they arranged it so that my brother and I would inherit the farm when they passed away, with Bill receiving 45% and me getting 55%. I was given the majority control because I helped them manage the farm alongside my regular job. I didn't receive payment for this work, but we lived without paying rent on the property, and of course, I would eventually inherit the majority ownership. It was an ideal family setting, and we all loved it here. My oldest child is a 21-year-old girl, followed by a 20-year-old boy, a 17-year-old boy, and our youngest, a 15-year-old girl. Life was wonderful for all of us, and I had a very happy and loving marriage with Connie. Our children were amazing, my job was going smoothly, and the family farm was doing great. I've given you enough background to understand the situation, so now let me address the main issue, which is the reason for this message. Around 3 years ago, my brother got diagnosed with cancer. He wasn't good at taking care of himself and didn't seek treatment until his symptoms became unbearable. By the time they found the cancer, it had already spread to other parts of his body. He went through a tough time with chemotherapy and radiation treatments. It really took a toll on him, but he continued to work. Unfortunately, Bill passed away earlier this year, and it was a very emotional time for all of us, especially me. Bill looked up to me as his role model, and I helped him with several problems he faced throughout his life. Bill's routine was mainly going to work and then spending the rest of his time at bars and social clubs in town. He had a drinking problem that I helped him overcome 4 years before he passed away. He also had serious tax issues, which I helped him sort out. He was the type of person who struggled with life's basic tasks, and I was always there to support him. Because of this, we were very close. My wife and kids also cared for him, but they saw him as the eccentric Uncle Bill. He wasn't unintelligent or lazy, he simply lacked ambition or a desire to improve himself. Over the years, Bill had several girlfriends, but none of those relationships lasted. Most of them were women he met at the bars. He did date a nice girl once, and I thought it might lead to something more, but she eventually left him because of his drinking. My parents accepted Bill for who he was and didn't pressure him. They loved him unconditionally, just as they loved me. In his will, Bill named me as the executor of his estate and specified that I should receive 100% of all his assets. This included a life insurance policy, a small checking account, and his personal belongings, such as his motorcycle and truck. About 2 weeks after his funeral, I was at Bill's place, paying bills and going through the piles of paperwork he had on his kitchen table. I found a statement from an out-of-town bank there. The account had over $70,000 in it. I was really surprised by the amount, but what surprised me even more were the names on the statement. The account was in Bill's name, and my youngest son, who I'll call Joe, was listed as the payable on death beneficiary. This confused me. I wondered why my brother set up the account like this, and why he chose only Joe as the beneficiary. Bill wasn't any closer to Joe than my other kids. In fact, he was probably closer to the rest of my kids than Joe. I was puzzled but couldn't figure it out. I thought about calling my wife and parents to tell them, but then I decided not to do it just yet. The next day I went to the bank. Since I was the executor, I could find out that Bill opened the money market account a month after Joe was born and regularly added money to it every 2 weeks. At this point, I started thinking there must be some connection between Bill and Joe. I even wondered if Bill and Connie had an affair. Was Joe actually Bill's son? It was making me really anxious. That night, I went back to Bill's house and went through his files, trying to find something that could give me a clue. I spent hours searching through everything in the house, and then I found it. Something that changed my life forever. It was 2 old photos of my wife. In one, she had no shirt on, and in the other, she was holding a beer and wearing nothing at all. Both photos were taken in Bill's bedroom. My whole world fell apart. I stayed at Bill's house for several more hours that night, going back and forth between crying and feeling angry. Eventually, Connie called and asked what I was doing, so I went home. I didn't confront her right then because I needed time to think about what I wanted to do. I actually considered just ignoring what I had found. After all, the pictures were from years ago, and my brother was no longer alive. But I quickly realized I could never live with myself if I ignored it. What I decided to do first was to tell my parents what I had discovered, and that's what I did the following day. I took the afternoon off and met with them at the farm office. I showed them the bank account and then showed them the pictures of my wife. My parents couldn't believe it. They were both upset and disgusted by what I had found. They understood the situation just as well as I did. They asked me what I was planning to do. I told them I intended to talk to Connie and if it turned out to be true, I would file for a divorce. They understood, but my mom advised me to listen to her and think carefully before taking any action. That evening, after dinner, I took Connie with me to Bill's house. She thought we were going there to help clean and organize things. When we entered the house, I sat her down and said, "We need to talk." Then I got a packet containing the bank statement and pictures of her. I gave her the bank statement first. She looked at it and just said, "Wow." She couldn't believe that Bill had saved so much money. I asked her if she noticed anything unusual on the statement, and she said no, just the amount. I then asked her to read the entire statement aloud, starting from the top. She read the bank's name and address, and then read Bill's name, followed by "payable on death to Joe, our last name." When she read this, she looked up at me with a shocked expression. I think she realized right then that she was caught. She said, "I wonder why Bill did this." I asked her if there was something she wanted to tell me, and she said no, shaking her head. I asked her again if she was sure, and she confirmed that she was. I handed her the photos, and she immediately froze, with tears in her eyes. She said, "Let me explain," and I encouraged her to do so. She excused herself to the bathroom, and I heard her throwing up in there. She came out 15 minutes later and admitted to the affair she had with Bill 18 years ago. She called it stupid and selfish, claiming it only lasted for a couple of weeks. Connie said she realized her mistake quickly and ended it. She insisted that since then, she had distanced herself from Bill and only interacted with him when other family members were around. I then asked her if Joe was Bill's son, and she said no, he was definitely mine. I asked her how she was so sure. She said she just knew he was, and even if he wasn't, she considered him mine because I raised him. I told her not to go there because this was about her relationship with Bill, not my relationship with Joe. She cried more and begged for my forgiveness, but I didn't show her any sympathy or comfort. Instead, I got up to leave and told her not to come home until she had settled down and cleaned herself up because I didn't want our kids to see her like that. I went home, and she returned about an hour later. She kept asking me to talk, but I told her we would have time to do that later. We slept in the same bed that night, but I refused her attempts to snuggle with me, and I turned away. She cried silently for most of the night without sleeping. The next day, I took a day off from work and went to the main house to talk to Mom and Dad. I informed them about Connie's confession, and once again, they couldn't believe it. I also made it clear that I intended to divorce Connie. My mom asked if that's what I truly wanted, and I replied that I didn't want this, but after what she had done, I couldn't trust her anymore and couldn't continue the marriage. After meeting with my parents, I returned home and told Connie about my decision to file for divorce. She completely broke down and begged me, saying that this all happened a long time ago and that she knew Joe was my son. I told her again that Joe wasn't the issue, and my love for him wouldn't change, no matter who his biological father was. I explained that this was about her and me, and she had betrayed me in a significant way. I emphasized that it didn't matter if it happened 18 years ago or even 1,800 years ago. In the afternoon, I met with the lawyer we use for the farm. He recommended a divorce attorney who was a friend of his, and I had an appointment with them later that day to start the divorce process. Since the farm and the 3 houses were part of the corporation, they weren't at risk in the divorce settlement. However, the attorney explained that our other assets would likely be divided evenly, even with the infidelity involved. He also mentioned that because my wife had never worked outside the home, I might have to pay spousal support for at least 5 years, possibly more. He said we would fight this in court, but based on his experience with similar cases, that was the expected outcome. I was prepared for this, and money wasn't my primary concern. I just wanted to end the marriage. When I got home, I told Connie about the attorney's advice, and she became very upset. She cried and begged for a second chance, but I kept telling her no. Then I informed her that I would be talking to the kids that weekend. I mentioned that I would first talk to Joe and then meet with the rest of the kids together with Joe to tell them about the situation. She asked if she could be part of the meetings, but I told her no. She could meet with them after I had talked to them. Saturday morning arrived, and I spoke to Joe about something important. We went to the creek on the farm, where we have a pavilion and picnic benches. It was there that I delivered the news to him. He was understandably devastated and very concerned. He asked me if I would still love him if he wasn't my biological son. I reassured him that I absolutely would. I told him not to worry about that because whether he and his siblings were biologically mine or not, my love for them would stay the same. I explained that the issue was between his mother and me and that he and his siblings were not at fault. I also made it clear that I would be divorcing her, emphasizing that it was entirely due to the affair with Uncle Bill and had nothing to do with him. We sat there talking for a couple of hours. I informed him that the next step was to meet with his siblings whenever he felt ready. He asked for some time to prepare, and I told him to take all the time he needed to feel comfortable. We went back to the house and acted like everything was normal, but my wife was acting differently, and my kids noticed it right away. We spent most of the afternoon by the pool, playing games like cornhole and tossing the frisbee. It seemed like a typical summer weekend for us, except for the dark secret that was about to be revealed. After dinner, Joe approached me and said he was ready to talk to his brothers and sisters, but they all had plans that evening with their friends. So we decided to have the conversation the following morning. We all got up the next day, had breakfast, and went to Sunday church services as we usually did. After church, we returned home, and I told the kids that I needed to talk to them privately on the back patio. My daughter asked if Mom would be joining us, and I said not right now, but she would meet with them later. This made the kids uneasy. I shared the news with them, and it was difficult to see the shock on their faces. They reacted as you might expect, disbelief, followed by anger, and then sadness. I explained that I would be divorcing their mom, and they all started to cry. We had a long conversation, and eventually they understood my decision. My daughter expressed her anger and said she didn't want anything to do with her mother. I advised each of them that they are young adults and should process this in their own way. I also encouraged them not to judge their mother based solely on this situation, but to consider their entire relationship, which had been very good. They agreed, but they were still angry, and none of them wanted to meet with her right away. I mentioned that I wanted to get DNA tests for each of them. I told them that their mom claimed she was with Uncle Bill for only a short time, but I wanted the DNA tests for my own peace of mind and to know the truth. I assured them that if the tests showed that any of them weren't biologically mine, it wouldn't change anything because they were legally my children, and I would love them the same way, even if they turned out not to be my biological kids. Later that evening, their mom met with them in the dining room, and it was a highly emotional conversation. I was outside during that time, but could hear parts of their discussion. In the end, the kids told their mother that they loved her, but they would never see her in the same way and probably wouldn't forgive her for what she did to me and our family. This was incredibly hard for her to hear, but she deserved it. From that night until our divorce was finalized, my wife slept in the guest room. The divorce process took nearly 8 months. During this time, my wife tried to convince me daily to stay together and seek marriage counseling, but I didn't change my mind. 3 months after the day I found out about the affair, my parents received a significant offer from a developer to buy the house my family lived in, along with the surrounding 80 acres, for a considerable amount of money. My parents and I decided to accept the offer as a business decision, so my wife, our 2 youngest kids, and I moved out 60 days later. My wife moved into a 3-bedroom apartment in town, and this is when the reality of everything hit her hard. She became very depressed to the point where she needed multiple medications to cope. I temporarily moved back into my parents' home. During this time, I decided to build my dream house on the backside of the farm, something I had wanted to do for a while, and this seemed like the right opportunity. I worked with an architect to design the house, which turned out to be a mid-sized log cabin with 3 bedrooms. The house is now finished, and I live there with my 2 youngest kids. They also spend a few nights a week with their mom. My ex-wife is still struggling with depression, but she's gradually getting better. She wants to reconcile and get back together, but I have no interest in that. I treat her with respect, more like someone I have an obligation to, but I no longer have any romantic feelings for her. It's quite strange how discovering the affair turned off my love for her as if it were a switch. We still communicate daily, but I try to limit our conversations to matters concerning our kids. She doesn't have anyone here besides our family, so I can't completely cut her off. Again, I feel a sense of obligation towards her. When it came to the DNA tests, it turned out that all of my kids are indeed biologically mine. Phew. All the stress, drama, and sleepless nights were unnecessary, but I needed to find out. However, this didn't change my feelings toward Connie. She betrayed me in the worst possible way, and I'll never forget or fully forgive her. I still can't figure out why Bill named Joe as the beneficiary on that account. My ex insists they never talked about paternity, and I believe her in this regard. Perhaps Bill simply assumed or maybe even wished that Joe was his. In general, I feel content with where I am now and the relationships I have with my kids and my ex-wife. Even though I'll never trust her again, I do care about her and want her to have a happy life. I'm not sure why I decided to share this, but putting it into words has made me feel better and has made me even more grateful for how things turned out. If you've made it this far, thanks for reading my story, and I wish you all the best of luck.